Hello and good evening. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's Planting for Pollinators program. Naturalist Jenny and I are quite excited for it. I'm Ranger Elena, and I have the pleasure of moderating tonight's program. I work for the Sherburne National Wildlife Refuge, and we are going to start off tonight's program from a brief message from a partner of ours at the Friends of Sherburne. They're a nonprofit that both supports and partners with the refuge. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Sue Hicks.
Hi, thanks,
Hello.
Elena. Yes. As Elena said, the Friends of Sherburne is a nonprofit organization, and we exist to support the refuge. And Elena has a slide that will show you some of the ways we do that. Well, you can see on the left, we're big, and there's a school bus, and in normal years, we are supporting 2 schools in the area to visit, have students visit 3 times a year. So education is a big emphasis of ours. You'll also see some photos on the right of the Wildlife Festival, which of course we couldn't have last year, but we sure hope maybe this year. We do other things like lots of different projects that we help to fund. For example, interpretive signs and improvements to the wildlife drive. We have a welcome station there now that will be available once the drive opens again. And that was funded by the Friends and a grant that we got. So there are a lot of things that we can do to support the refuge. And if you're a member of the Friends, then you can help support the refuge as well. So next slide, please. So if you join, what's involved? Well, it's pretty easy, $20 donation, and you get all the up-to-date refuge news, what's going on at the refuge, you know, bird sightings, fun stuff to do all throughout the year. Plus, we have a nature store, and our Friends members get 10% off on their purchases. And of course, you get the warm fuzzies from supporting the refuge. And if you'd like to join, it's easy. Go to exploresherburne.org and to the membership section and click on join, and you'll be one of us. So what else is new? Next slide, please. Well, since we can't have the store open, we do have online shopping. Shop from the comfort of home in your sweatpants, whatever. And we have some books available through the store and other items that will help you if you want to start gardening for pollinators. And here there are a couple bee books, and then we have our native wildflower guide that is has many photos of flowers that you'll see at the refuge, but they could be growing in your backyard too. So next, but we have more than books and field guides, although that is a big seller at the Eagle's Nest Nature Store. This is the time of year, it's warming up. Maybe you need a new t-shirt. We have a lot of nature themed t-shirts. We have Sherburne baseball caps. And if your kids are ready to get out and about, we have Naturalist backpacks with cool stuff in there for kids to use to go and explore in the yard or at the refuge. We even have like note cards and other fun stuff. So check out SherburneEaglesNestStore.com and see what you can find. We also offer curbside pickup as an option if you just, you know, if the mail is not the way you like to have your items delivered. So that's it. I'll let Elena and Jenny take over.
Okay, thank you so much, Sue. We're really excited to have the online store, and there's a lot of good resources this time of year as we start to prepare for spring. The warmer temperatures have us all excited. I skipped a step. Let me go back to housekeeping. I got ahead of myself tonight. So I apologize for that. Let's go. We just wanted to share a couple things with you before we jumped into the program. So this program is being recorded. So if for some reason someone else you knew that was interested in watching the program couldn't make it tonight, or you want to reference this down the road as you're potentially putting your plans into action, you can find the video on the Friends Facebook page under the video tab, and it should be listed under there. We encourage you to post comments throughout as the program goes, and if you have questions that we can answer in the moment, we will try our best to do so. Otherwise, please do ask questions. It allows us to make it this program as interactive as it can be, and we will have a dedicated question and answer session at the end. And then if we don't have time to answer your question while we're live tonight, we will answer it in the comments probably by tomorrow. With that though, I will introduce Naturalist Jenny. Jenny has a great program for us lined up, and we're really excited for this one. We're both excited for spring, some warmer temperatures and some plants poking through the surface. And so it's that time of year when everyone's excited to buy plants. And so I know that's something I tend to do too. And I don't always tend to have a plan. Sometimes I just impulse buy. And then, it's better if you have a plan in place, I think.
Yeah, I think if you're looking to have a garden, yeah, if you're buying a couple plants, it's perfectly fine, right? We see a pretty plant and we want to buy it, so.
Yeah, so that's what we're, here for tonight. This was something folks had requested over the winter, I think, when we were dreaming about green things and colorful flowers. And so Jenny's going to give us a great overview of not only, what is a pollinator garden and why are they important, but some steps to get started. This is definitely not your one-stop shop. There's a lot involved with this, but I think it's a good brief overview, and it'll give you kind of a good idea.
Yeah, I think it'll be a good one. I'm excited about it. I love plants. And I love people who love plants. And I'm assuming if you're watching this, you love plants. So.
Okay, let me bring up. And we should be good.
All right. So like Elena said, I'm going to go over a little bit about what a pollinator garden is. I'm going to talk a little bit about pollinators and a bit about things you can put in a garden to make it a pollinator garden to help those pollinators, and also maybe the first few steps you can think of taking this spring when we start getting into the planting season. So the first thing I think we should probably cover is, what is a pollinator garden? Pollinator garden has maybe been thrown around a lot, especially in the last maybe 5-10 years, being that we've had some issues with our pollinators, so putting a garden in would make sense. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to say that a pollinator garden is an area of native flowering plants that provides food to pollinators. Food is in the form of pollen and nectar, and or nectar. Some of them have both, some plants just have one. And why we might want to create a pollinator garden. Pollinators, and especially bees, are considered keystone species, which basically means that what they do in the wild impacts the lives of a lot of other animals. And if we didn't have them, that could negatively impact ecosystems more than, say, maybe an animal that's not necessarily considered a keystone species. pollinators, especially bees, pollinate flowers, right? A lot of those flowers depend on pollinators to create the seeds they need to make the next generation. So if they didn't have pollinators, they would never be pollinated, and then we'd never see seeds from those. And seeds and fruit that come from plants are very important to other wildlife that eat those once the seed has been made. And it's even really important for people too. I think about a third of our fruit and vegetable plants that we eat is because of pollinators, because they go and do that hard work to make sure that we get those seeds and vegetables and stuff that we then collect and eat. And unfortunately for these pollinators, their populations have been kind of declining. There's a lot of different factors that go into it, anything from habitat loss to pollution, stuff like that. So I think it's kind of important to put in these gardens, because then we at least give them space so that they can actually do what they need to do to live. And of course, for me, I like the look of pollinator gardens. It reduces stress for me when I go and walk in a pollinator garden. So it can certainly help us too in that stress level for a lot of people. And pollinator gardens can be any size. You don't have to have 3 acres to turn into a pollinator garden. It would be cool if you could do it because it looks great. But if you just have a small space, maybe it's just a small existing garden that's a little overgrown and you'd like to do something different with it, you can certainly turn that into a pollinator garden too, and that would be awesome. So we can't talk about pollinator gardens without talking a little bit about the pollinators that visit. And I just want to quick go over a few animals that do pollinate plants. Usually they're insects, but there's some other animals too that do pollinating. I think most of us in Minnesota love our ruby-throated hummingbirds, and they actually do visit flowers for nectar. So they're a pretty good pollinator depending on the plant species you have out. Believe it or not, flies are quite good pollinators too. There's a large group of flies that look a lot like bees. They color like that so that other animals leave them alone. But they're also important in the pollination of many flowers. Even those flies like not fruit gnats, fungus gnats, that we maybe don't like so much. I don't like to get them in my house, but they actually help pollinate some plants like Jack in the Pulpit, which is very interesting to me. Butterflies is another big one. The picture here is of a painted lady, and butterflies are probably one of the big ones that people love to see when they look at a garden. You know, those pretty wings flashing in the sun and all of that. Moths also do a decent amount of pollinating, depending on the species, usually in the evening or at night. And bumblebees, of course, are a big one. I'm sure a lot of us now know what a rusty patch bumblebee is, maybe not necessarily what it looks like, but that is an endangered species here. So it just kind of helps bring more importance to some of these pollinators. There are actually other kinds of bees too that do pollinating, such as sweat bees, carpenter bees, those kinds of creatures also visit flowers and pollinate. Some beetles do pollinating too. They will visit flowers and end up moving pollen from one plant to the next. And some wasps, I know we don't really like them, but there are a couple of species of wasps that do help in pollinating when it comes to some plants. So all of these pollinators are super important. But there's a lot of things that you can think about, or at least take into consideration when you're putting in a pollinator garden that do help these pollinators. One of the big ones is many blooms for all seasons. So what you want to try to find are a lot of different kinds of flowers. The more flowers you have, the more species of pollinators you can help and feed, and even help the rest of their life cycle too. So I'm talking like you can get flowers that are different sizes, different shapes, different colors, different scents even. Some flowers have very strong scents to attract certain pollinators, and that can be really important too. You also want to get a range of plants that have both nectar and pollen, or just nectar and just pollen. So I think kind of if you try to cover the different colors and shapes and stuff, you'll usually hit most of those pollen, nectar, or pollen and nectar flowers. The other thing is for all seasons. So the cool thing I think about native plants is they tend to not bloom like from the whole growing season. So most of them do not bloom from April to November. They kind of bloom in just shorter ranges. Generally speaking, like the spring range is like April through early June. Summer is maybe June through August. And then September, October, and sometimes into November would be the fall season. So you want to kind of pick plants out that bloom in all 3 of those seasons. to kind of cover, you know, these pollinators are going to be out all year. So to kind of give them food sources throughout each section of the year is very helpful for them. And the flowers I have here, this is just a small amount of flowers. Some of these might be cool in your garden. Some of these might not grow very well in your garden. But on the left here, I've got our spring bloom, a couple spring blooming flowers. The one on the top is Golden Alexander, and the one on the bottom is Columbine, which is visited by hummingbirds, by the way. The middle section is kind of my summer section. I have some purple prairie clover on the top, which is a bee magnet. And then the one on the bottom is butterfly milkweed, which has that beautiful orange flowers. And then of course we want to consider our fall blooming plants. I have a couple here on the right. The one on the top is stiff goldenrod. Most goldenrods bloom in the fall. And then we have an aster species, and I can't remember if this is sky blue aster or another one. There are several different blue purple asters, but those can certainly be ones you can consider for your garden. Another thing we might want to pay close attention to is buying native plants. There's a lot of plants out there in a lot of nurseries, and they kind of break them into maybe 3 different kinds of plants. And native is kind of the one that you want to look for. The native plants, if you put them in, tend to be lower maintenance. They're already adapted to the local conditions. So for example, butterfly weed, the orange flower on the last slide, likes to be in drier areas and tolerates drought quite well. So if you have an upland sandy area and you put that in there, once it's mature, it has a really good chance of surviving better, or at least not needing as much help in the drier conditions in the summer. Pollinators are also adapted to visit certain flowers. Each group of pollinators kind of has certain flowers that they're more attracted to. And the native ones have the natural colors that they're used to seeing. And these native plants also have the amounts of pollen and nectar that the animals are expecting to have when they visit these flowers for the most part. Cultivars are something you'll see a lot in nurseries. Oftentimes these are native plants that have been bred to look or act a certain way. So they might be looking for a specific color, or they might be looking for extra petals or a certain height. Unfortunately, when we breed for certain colors or behaviors, sometimes we accidentally breed out the nectar or pollen that's necessary for pollinators to use. So oftentimes flowers are bred to have extra petals, which can make them prettier in some people's opinion. But then the pollinators have no center flower to visit to find any pollen or nectar from. Yes, okay, so I got that. So the non-native plants, I just wanted to mention a little bit, because generally speaking, if you find a non-native plant pretty, we probably have either color or flower shape-wise a native equivalent that would work for it. Sometimes non-native plants also kind of run into the same problems that cultivars have. Our pollinators aren't used to seeing these plants. These are not the plants they're adapted to see. So they may not visit it as often, or maybe it doesn't have the right amount of pollen or nectar that they need. And sometimes these non-native plants can take over your garden, and I certainly wouldn't want you to spend your time and money making a beautiful garden only to find out you end up with one plant in it, which can be kind of sad, and I want to make sure you avoid that. So the one thing, if you're thinking, how on earth am I supposed to know if it's a cultivar or a native plant? The pictures I have here are common yarrow, which is a really cool plant. The white flowers are the actual native colors. And you can see the cultivar is kind of that violet purple color, which is pretty, but the bees might not know what they're looking for if they're looking for a white flower and the plant that normally has white flowers has pink flowers. That can maybe be a little confusing for them. But I'm going to talk just a tiny bit about scientific names. I'm not going to get too much into it, but you kind of want to look to make sure that the nursery you're going to has scientific names, because then they really know what they're doing with their plants. And if you look at the common yarrow scientific name, Achillea millefolium, it's got 2 parts to it. First one's capitalized, second one isn't. But usually that's the original plant. Even non-native will have just the 2 sets for them for the most part. So you might have to look it up to make sure you know what plant you're getting. But oftentimes the cultivars have these kind of fun, fancy names to catch your attention. This one would be like a new vintage violet yarrow or sundrop splash coreopsis or something like that. Generally speaking, if you see those fancy names, it's probably not fully native. And sometimes they'll put the scientific name with like vintage violet or the fancy name after it in quotes. And sometimes they'll even just put part of the scientific name with like an X or maybe like VAR to stand for variety. And then the fancy name, well, the one I had in here was like moonshine or something like that. So you can look for that if you're looking to do the native plants. That can certainly be helpful. Another thing I wanted to mention really quick in our next slide here is grasses, sedges, and more. So the flowers are super awesome, and I certainly love flowers myself. There are some other plants out there that can be helpful or add visual interest to your gardens, depending on how you want it to look. Grasses is one of them. I have two grasses on the left here. The top one is Canada Wild Rye, and the bottom one is Big Blue Stem. And then I have some sedges too, which I'll talk a little bit in a second, and then some ferns and some trees and shrubs. So grasses actually can hold some flowers up. Some flowers get rather heavy when they're blooming, and those grasses, as stiff as they are, can actually help hold up some of those plants, which can be super helpful. They're also very good at holding in soil. The flowers are too, but sometimes the grasses establish a little bit faster. So if you're concerned about erosion, grasses might be very helpful in that situation. Sedges are very similar to grasses. I have a Pennsylvania sedge kind of in the middle there, just to the right of the grasses. And these are really cool, good for woodlands. You find sedges in pretty much any habitat, but they're very prevalent in woodlands. There tend to be less grasses in the woodlands. So you might want to opt for some sedges. Like I said, they're basically the same as grasses. They usually don't grow as tall. Their flower heads look a little bit different and their stems tend to be triangular, but when you're just looking at it from a distance, it can look very similar to grasses. Ferns can be really cool too. I have a sensitive fern on the picture here. Again, those tend to grow in woodlands, although you can find them in other places. Although they do not flower or provide pollen that insects or pollinators visit, they can add visual interest to your woodlands. When it comes to woodland plantings, generally speaking, most of the flowers bloom in the spring. It's cool enough that it's not too hot yet for those plants to survive, and there aren't as many leaves on the trees to shade them out. So they usually bloom in the spring. So you might want to add a couple other plants that add some interest throughout the rest of the year. And ferns can be a good one. I would think that pollinators could certainly use ferns as habitat for resting and stuff like that when they're in the woodlands. And trees and shrubs, trees do flower, so do shrubs. Some of them are flowers that pollinators visit. Some of those flowers are wind pollinated, but if they're not pollinated by animals, then they are good habitat for those animals to rest and relax. Some of them are also host plants, which I'll talk about in the next slide in a little bit. But some of these trees and shrubs also flower. This is choke cherry that I have a picture here. It has beautiful, very fragrant flowers. This is a bee magnet. We have several of these. They're more like bushes, although they can grow into trees. We have several of these in our yard and the bees just go nuts for them. It's super cool to see them. And these ones do bloom more in the springtime. So you'll see a lot of stuff visiting there. So those can add a lot of visual interest. I also want to touch on host plants. I did mention that just a little bit ago. Host plants are plants that help animals complete their life cycles. So these animals will lay eggs on the plants, and then those creatures, usually caterpillars, although I'm sure there's some other animals that eat them, but I'm going to focus a little more on the caterpillars from moths and butterflies because those are the big host plant ones. But those young hatch out and then they eat that plant, and once they grow, then they turn into adult butterflies or moths. So host plants are very important. They're great to put in your garden, obviously, because then your creatures, your pollinators, don't have to travel as far to complete their entire life cycle. This does mean that some of your plants that you plant will get eaten, but it's kind of important that they get eaten because then we can help support these pollinators even more. Generally speaking, the plants will be okay, the ones that get chewed on a little bit. Sometimes they don't make it, but for the most part, they're used to this happening to them, so they should be good to go. So some pollinators actually depend on just one species, and some pollinators lay their eggs on several different species that their caterpillars can eat. On the left here, I have an eastern tiger swallowtail caterpillar. Those dots that look like eyes on them are actually fake eyes. They're really cool caterpillars. They turn into yellow butterflies with black stripes. And aspen is one of several species that they use as host plants. And of course, in the middle, we have our iconic monarch butterfly caterpillar, which visit only milkweed species. I have common milkweed pictured here, but they will visit the orange butterfly weed and several other species of milkweed as well. And I also wanted to show one of them that uses grasses as a host plant. This particular pollinator uses several different species of grasses. This is blue grama, the picture I have here. And these are on the right. Yes, on the right. And this is a tenucha moth, a Virginia tenucha moth. And I just learned how to pronounce that because it's CT. So that's super exciting. And this is a cute little caterpillar. He feeds on grasses and then will pupate and turn into a moth. And that particular moth, the Virginia tenucha moth, does visit flowers and pollinates it. Not all moths do, but this is one that does. And so I'll get into just a couple other considerations you might want to think of when you are going to pick out your plants for your pollinator garden. Use of chemicals. So some people do spray for insects, pest insects like mosquitoes and stuff like that. Unfortunately, insecticides aren't very selective, which means that if you spray it in an area, you usually kill all of the insects, not just the one that you're trying to get. So when you're doing a pollinator garden, I'm going to guess that your goal is probably not to kill your pollinators. So I would say do your very best not to do insecticides. And if you have to use herbicides to remove some weeds, just make sure you're being very careful with it and that you're not spraying any of the pollinators that you'd like to keep so that they stay strong and healthy. Grouping plants can also be very helpful. If you have some larger groups of one species, you can still kind of spread them out, but to kind of have some of those larger chunks can be helpful to pollinators because then they don't have to travel as far to get the pollen or the nectar that they need. Bare dirt patches, it seems like a weird thing to have in a garden because we usually want flowers and plants from wall to wall, but a lot of bee species, solitary as well as social bee species, actually nest in the ground. So to have that bare dirt available to them, then they can lay their eggs and do the whole cycle right inside your garden, which is super fascinating to see. I know in our yard, we kind of have a patch. The soil is pretty silty and grass doesn't grow very well there, but we have these bees called cellophane bees that actually dig their nests out in there and lay their eggs inside of it. It is so cool to see. They're like one of the first bees we see in the spring, so it's always so fun to see them there. You can also add a few other things, rocks, logs, and homes. I think these also add visual interest to your garden if you're looking for something like that. A lot of pollinators will use logs either to rest or to maybe overwinter if they do that. Having hollow stems. So, and I'll mention this a little more when we get to the management portion, which is kind of towards the end of the presentation. But leaving those stems standing can actually be very helpful because a lot of bees lay their eggs inside of hollow stems, which I'm sure would be really cool to see. I haven't seen it yet in the wild, but I sure would love to. And if you want to, you can add things like mason bee homes. Just make sure that you keep those clean and change out the stems or the straws or whatever you put in there often, like every year, just to avoid disease transmission and stuff like that. So now that we have a ton of considerations to look at, we are going to look at step 1 of planning your garden, which is choosing a space. It might seem like a really easy one, but sometimes it's something that people are like, oh, I guess I'll just put it over here, I'll put it over there. It might actually benefit you and have more plants survive in your garden if you choose your space with a little bit of thought. So of course, the first thing you want to do is, where do you want to put it? If you have an existing garden that you want to just replace for, well, you've got it right there. So you know what your space is going to be. Maybe you have a low spot in your yard that collects water when it rains heavy. That might be a good spot for a rain garden. Maybe there's an unused section of your backyard, like a ditch, or maybe there's a woodland that you don't go into very often. Those are great spaces to put pollinator gardens in. Another thing you want to think about when choosing a space is, what do you want it to look like? Do you want it to be wild, where the plants just kind of pop up where they like to and you just pull out the weeds when you see them? Or do you want it a little more manicured? Maybe it's a front yard and you want to make sure that it still looks a little bit like those traditional gardens. You can have either one or both if you're looking for a pollinator garden. And 3 main things you want to look at when you choose your space. How much sunlight is it getting? When we look at sunlight, they usually consider full sun, 6 or more hours of direct sunlight a day. Part sun or part shade is usually 3 to 6 hours of direct sunlight a day. And then shade is dappled sunlight throughout the whole day. So plants do need some sort of sunlight, but if some of them prefer less sunlight, so that kind of dappled light, almost like light through trees, is kind of what they're talking about when they say shade. If you have like an area between your garage and your house and it never gets sun, you might have some problems growing plants there. So you might want to pick a different place if you're looking for a pollinated garden. Soil is also important. Go ahead, get down, get dirty, hold the soil in your hands. Is it really sandy? Is it clay? Is it kind of loamy? Is there a lot of organic material? Because that can kind of help you decide some of the plants you want to do too. And usually related to soil is moisture. So is it spongy and wet all year round? Is it only wet in the spring when the snow melts and then it's dry? Is it kind of an upland area that's dry a lot, especially in the summertime? Those are important considerations, especially when you go to shop for your plants, because a lot of native nurseries organize theirs by sunlight and or moisture and sometimes soil. So you can literally then just go to that section and get your plants from that one section. And then you know your plants have a higher chance of surviving if you use those three items. And I just wanted to quick, in our next slide here, we're gonna go over just a few ideas if you're not even sure what kind of garden you wanna do and you have no idea where you wanna put it. Shorelines are really cool options. So if you have a lake home or you live on a lake, or even a stream, having a pollinator garden as your shoreline is an awesome option. Plus, it can keep the geese from walking onto your lawn, since there's a barrier of like 6 feet of tall plants, which can be very helpful if you battle any geese on your lawn, because I know some people don't like the geese droppings on their lawn. A rain garden is a good option. Maybe you have a low spot in your yard that collects water when it floods and grass just doesn't grow there well. A rain garden might be a great option. A woodland, if you have areas with lots of trees, you can certainly put in some woodland plants. A prairie or a savanna. So a prairie tends to be more full sun, and a savanna is maybe more full sun to part sun. So if you have a couple large oak trees in your yard, but a lot of your yard gets sun, a savanna might be an awesome option for you. If you have no trees and there's a ton of sun, a prairie might be a good option for you, especially if the soil is dry. That can certainly be helpful. And again, I'll probably say this several times through the presentation, but make sure you know if you want a manicured versus a wild look, because if you kind of want a manicured look, but you buy seed, you're probably going to end up with a wild look, because it's very hard to weed out all of the plants that germinated that you suddenly don't want in that one spot they were in. So certainly have that in mind, because that can help you a lot too. Step two here is choose your plants. So you kind of want to decide, do you want to do seedlings or seed or both? All of those are certainly options. Seedlings tend to establish faster because they're already partway grown and their roots are already somewhat developed. So they tend to grow a little faster. They do cost more, obviously, than seed, because it takes more to produce them. And oftentimes initially you need more water if you're using actual plants, especially just in the short term, which I'll talk about a little bit more later, but they tend to need more water than seed off the get-go. Seed takes a little longer to establish, so you have to be a little more patient when it comes to seed. It does cost less. And generally speaking, you're going to get a wilder look if you use seed, unless you use it very specifically. And the initial water needs tend to be lower because you don't really have to water the seed. They kind of germinate as the moisture level happens. So that's something that you might want to consider. You can also use both. A lot of companies produce different plants than they do seed. It just depends on how well those plants can grow, or if they're better at germinating via seed on the ground. So using both works too, if you're interested in that. Again, keep in mind your local conditions when you choose your plants. If your site is really wet, don't buy wild lupin, even though it's pretty, because it's probably not going to survive. It likes it dry. So you might just have to find a wetland plant that has a similar color to wild lupin that you might like too. And make sure you take into consideration all of those things that benefit pollinators, you know, flower colors, shapes, all of those kinds of things will certainly help. If you can, find the plants or the seed that have been sourced as close to you as possible. Those plants are more adapted to your local conditions, so they'll have a better chance of survival. Usually like to say, you know, if you're getting like blue grama, which is a grass I talked about earlier, try not to get your seed from Texas, because those plants are usually a little more adapted to local conditions in Texas, and may not do as well as seed if you got them that were from Minnesota, if you were planting in Minnesota. So just keep that in mind. And then we are going to make a list of plants. This might seem overwhelming. I have looked up, and we'll see if we can get some links in during our Facebook Live. Otherwise, we can put them in after, about some plant lists if you're not sure what you should be planting. The Minnesota DNR has a pretty good website about planting for pollinators that includes plant lists. I think the PDF they had on there broke it down by habitat. So if that's still a little too overwhelming, you can pop over to the University of Minnesota Extension, and they have a really good shorter plant list that might help you start your list. Or you can plant those and then add some plants in future years if you're interested in that. You can also visit some local native nurseries. They usually have very helpful people that can help you choose your plants. You can also look for their seed mixes. Even if you're buying plants, you can look at, say, a short dry seed mix if you have a dry area, and you can see the plants they have listed in that mix, and you can maybe choose seedlings based on that list, or you can mix and match. If you're getting seed and you want to buy a seed mix, the list is kind of already there for you, unless you're looking for a specific species that isn't on there. But they do, I'm pretty sure several of those companies do custom mixes if you're looking for something super specific. And then I just wanted to get a little note on erosion or weed control. Erosion control is usually just for steeper slopes, which are actually great candidates for native gardens because you don't need to mow them, so you don't have to worry about rolling down the hill with your push lawnmower if you fall. And places sell like erosion control blanket, which is basically just like a sheet of straw that you can then lay down over the top of your seed, and then it just helps the water sweep over the top of it, so it's not taking the soil and your seeds down the hill. There is also a clean straw that you can use to lay down. And this also help with weed control. The other thing you can use is cover crop, which is usually just some sort of an annual like rye or oat that you seed along with your plants or your native seed. And it basically pops up and holds the soil in place, so that if you get those heavy rains, everything doesn't wash down the hill. So now that we have our plants chosen, or at least we have some plants that we think are good, we can look a little bit at a garden layout. And I actually recommend, this can be helpful unless you're making a really small garden, to have a map of your garden. So take out a piece of graph paper, go back to 7th grade or whenever we graphed things out, and draw your yard. Put your house in, your shed, maybe that oak tree in the back that you want to keep, and try to make it to scale. And then you can kind of add your garden where you want to on the paper. You can draw your swooping lines, or if you want it really square, that can be super helpful. And you can also add zones to it. My little mini garden layout I have here is kind of modeled after a rain garden. So the taller, wetter plants are going to be in the center with the shorter plants on the outside. You probably want to have your shorter plants on the outside, or the front, and your taller plants in the back or on the inside, so that you can see all of your plants. If you're looking for a wild look, you probably don't have to worry as much about this. But it can be helpful if you want to see all of your plants. I wouldn't want you to plant a really tall plant in front of your short plant and then find out you can't see it. I feel like that would be kind of a bummer. So once you have that, the other thing, make sure you know how big your plants are going to be at maturity so you don't plant them too close together. Wild rose can need as much as like 3 feet wide of space so that it gets as big and healthy as it can be. So we don't really want to plant other plants right next to it. You might want to give it just a little bit of room. And sometimes mapping that out on paper can help a lot. And then I also suggest go outside and mark it. Grab some flags or whatever you can use to mark it and just stake it out. Because sometimes you might stake it out and go, ooh, you know what, that's really big for the start of my garden. So just have a section of that. And then in future years, if your garden is awesome, you can add to it, which is super cool. Or you might find out it's really small and you actually wanted something bigger. This can also help to make sure that you measure the area so you know how much seed or plants. Most companies will let you know the poundage in ounces per square feet for a successful planting. And you may up the amount of flowers and lower the amount of grasses depending on what you're looking for. And plants, you know, they can be put anywhere from like 6 inches to 2 feet or more apart depending on what you're looking for. But that will kind of help you determine about how many plants or seed you need so that you don't buy too much or too little. We don't need you to go back to the store or find out you have too much seed, although you could use that in a second garden, but that is totally up to you. So once we do that, the other thing we want to think about in the next slide here is timing and preparation. So timing, generally speaking, we want to plant or seed either in the spring or in the late summer, but probably more into the fall. That summer area for plants and sometimes seed it's really dry during that time, you know, like July into August. So if you put seed down, they're probably not going to germinate right away. If you put plants down, you're just going to be putting a ton of water into them. And it makes more sense to save water and maybe do it during a better growing time. So I looked at several websites to figure out, they usually recommend seeding in the spring or the fall. So you can do that anywhere from April to early July, and then maybe September to the hard freeze. And when you're seeding, you can actually seed into the winter too, if you would like to. That's certainly fine. When you do it in the fall, and the winter, it's not going to germinate until the next growing season, which is good because we don't want those plants germinating and then getting a hard frost and dying. And for plants, you probably want to go more for like May to mid-July, and then maybe September to like a couple months before the hard frost, just to make sure that those plants get established a little bit before they have to go dormant. So preparation. We might want to just buy our plants and rip out the grass and put it in. But preparation is actually really important for a native garden. The better preparation you do, the more successful your planting is going to be, or at least the less weeds you may have to remove from your garden. Some people love weeding, so I'll leave that up to you depending on your preparation, because preparation can take anywhere from 1 to several growing seasons to accomplish. And this totally depends on what you have existing. From what I've read, removing sod, you usually have less time for preparation. And if you're going for like replacing stuff in, say, like an old farm field that has been grazed, that might take a few more seasons to do. And I can't give any specifics necessarily to what would work for your place. A lot of the native garden companies would be more than happy to help you figure out what would work for preparation. You can hire people to do it. There's a lot of books and resources for that too. I found one from the Minnesota DNR that talked a little bit about preparation based on some of the conditions you might have, say if it's a farm field or sod or something like that. That can certainly be helpful. And I'm pretty sure I sent that link to Elena so she can put it on, but if not, I can get it on later. And there's many different ways to accomplish this. Obviously, the main goal of preparation is to remove your existing unwanted plants. So if you have maybe a traditional manicured garden and you're going to replace your non-native roses with native roses, your preparation will probably be pretty easy. Mostly remove old plant and put in new plant. But again, if you have a lot more weed grass and stuff like that in it, you might have some more preparation. And you can do anything from using herbicides properly, to mowing, Like I said, you might just have to hand pull. Shallow tilling might have to happen. You can smother it with a black tarp or something like that. There's a lot of different ways to do it. Everyone kind of has their own recommended thing, and each thing works different. So if you try one thing and it doesn't work quite well for the first season, you can maybe think of something else you might be able to do for that. And there's lots of sources and people you can talk to help with that. So now we have figured out what plants we wanted. We planned out our garden. We have it prepared, so we are ready to plant our garden. Super exciting. We went to the store, we got our plants. They're here, they're green. Some of them are blooming. It's super exciting. Find your neighbors, find your friends, because they will be very helpful for you depending on how big your garden is. You kind of have like a pollinator planting party or something, social distance now, but soon we might not have to do that. If you are using seed, I just have a couple things. Most of the stuff is kind of pretty self-explanatory, but you want to make sure you roughen the soil gently. So you don't want to dig down real deep, but just kind of roughen the soil a little bit, because we're looking for good seed to soil contact. The better that is, the more seeds will germinate, and the faster your garden will establish. And I recommend and you may end up with several different bags. If you're getting grass and flowers, they tend to sell those in separate bags. So you can just keep the bags separate. It's not a big deal. Usually flower seed is a lot smaller than grass seed, so you might end up accidentally dumping a big pile of it if you're mixing the seed together. So I usually recommend to keep it apart and take half of your bag and spread it across the whole area. And then take the other half of that bag and spread it across in another direction across the whole area. This will just ensure that you have seed in all parts of your garden, instead of being halfway through and running out of seed and looking at your dirt, and now you have to go back and get more flowers. And generally speaking, seed does not have to be laid down super thick. If you think of like laying down sodgrass seed, you usually want to put that in really thick. But for these ones, you don't have to have it nearly as thick as that. And you'll notice that when you use half the bag and then the other half, that you're not going to have super thick coverage, because the plants need space to grow. It reduces the competition, and then you're not wasting your money on seeds that might sit there and not germinate for a long time. And then if you're going to do any erosion control, blanket straw, you can do that over the top of your seed. You can put your cover crop right in with the seed too, and it'll pop up right away. If you're using seedlings, I recommend laying out your seedlings over your whole garden so that you know what the layout is, so that if you get them all set out and you go, uh-oh, I put all of my yellow flowers in this corner of my garden, you can move them around before you plant them instead of having to dig them up and move them. It can be super helpful to do that. When you remove the plants from the containers, don't pull on the green plant, because you might separate it from the roots. You can just kind of push it out from the bottom, and then you just want to loosen those roots up and then put it in the ground, put dirt in it. And you usually want to water these pretty well when you first plant them. A lot of plants kind of get a little shocked when they're pulled out of their pot and put into the ground. So adding that water can certainly help them. And for a few weeks, especially if it doesn't rain, you'll probably have to water those for a little bit. So you may not want to use seedlings in a large area if you don't have a sprinkler or something like that. You could always just start in one area and then work your way in the next seasons if you're interested in that. If you are using straw or erosion control blanket, I doubt you'll be using cover crop if you're putting seedlings in. It's usually typically just for seed. But if you are putting like blanket or straw down, you want to do that first. So lay your erosion control blanket down, and then you can just cut the holes in the blanket and put the plants in that small hole you cut. And the straw you want to put over the top first too, otherwise you're going to have areas around your seedlings where there's no straw, because it'll just be laying on top of your plant. So just keep that in mind. And like I said, you can use seed and seedlings. So if you want to, just do the seed stuff first, do your erosion control, and then add the seedlings over the top, and then water your seedlings. And you should be good to go for that. And then another thing I want to mention a little bit, and this is kind of our last thing, is management when it comes to your pollinator garden. It is a little bit different depending on what you do. Seeded areas, you kind of don't want to do a lot of weed pulling, because you're going to disturb all of the seeds you put down. So usually they recommend, especially the first growing season, just mowing the weeds either before they go to seed or before they start shading out your plants. Usually about like 10-12 inches is the tallest you want them to be, and then you can just cut them shorter. You might have to do another mow the beginning of the second growing season, but then you can kind of start looking at doing some of the hand weeding and stuff, because you'll start seeing your teeny little plants growing, and it's super exciting. So then you can kind of just do your battle against the weeds if you have some. If you have more of a manicured garden, this is usually just removing any weeds that pop up. Same for planting seedlings. At least try to weed around each seedling so they have some space, less competition, and then they'll grow faster and better. And you can also benefit wildlife depending on how you do your upkeep. So keeping the dead plants standing, like if you don't mow them in the fall, you can leave them up all winter. That actually allows animals to hide inside those plants if they need to, such as the dark-eyed juncos that come in the winter. It's a great place for them to hang out. And then in the spring you can mow, and I suggest mowing your stems. And we have this really awesome diagram from the University of Minnesota Extension Bee Lab that kind of steps you through why you want to do this stuff. And it's basically to benefit those stem nesting bees. So you can cut back those stems in the spring, but keep them at varying heights, even up to 2 feet. Or sometimes they'll just break off themselves naturally, and then the bees will lay their eggs in there. And those eggs will hang out in the stems. If they lay them in the fall, they'll hang out in the stems over the winter, and then they'll come out in the spring. And it kind of repeats itself. And when you have that stubble up, eventually the plant that grows in the spring will just cover it up and you won't even see it. And then you'll be helping pollinators by doing that. Let's see. Oh yes, and don't cut the flower heads off when they start dying, because they will produce seed, and those seeds, or sometimes fruits, will be food for other animals, not just pollinators. Turkeys and all kinds of stuff certainly enjoy that. For the most part, for long-term management, pollinator gardens are lower maintenance than most other gardens. Once they're established, they usually require less water. You don't need to fertilize them because they do just fine in the conditions you put them in. You may have to do some periodic mowing. Some types of pollinator gardens might benefit from burning, but there are a lot of restrictions and stuff on that. Some areas are just not safe to do it, so you might just mow, but it can benefit certain gardens that way. And of course, some periodic mowing here, or weeding here and there. When you find a little patch of weeds, maybe a seed blew from who knows where and landed in there, and you don't want it in there, so you can take it out. I will say it is super fun to watch these baby plants grow. You will be jumping around when you see your first little seedlings pop up if you do seed, or to watch those seedlings you plant start growing and flowering. The last recommendation I would have, keep your seed lists. If you planted a seed mix, keep that mix list, because it can help you identify what plants are popping up. When you do seed, you don't know what plant's going to pop up where. So it can be very helpful, because then you can compare that to this plant you found growing. So if you know if it's a weed or not. And the seed tags might be helpful too from seedlings, especially if they start seeding themselves and you like to let them go. It might be easy to see then what plants you are looking at. So that is what I've got. I would like to hear what you have, if you have any questions about pollinator gardens. I will do my very best, although some things are very specific.
It's true. It's hard when it gets specific.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we had one question that has already kind of been answered, but I think it can start us off. Are there plants that I can plant this spring?
Yes, lots of plants you can plant this spring. Yeah, spring is kind of one of those times to do your planting. If you're doing seedlings, wait till May, because you don't want to extra spring frost to kill them. But seeding you could almost do now if you wanted to, as long as your place is prepped. Again, if you just throw seeds on a lawn, you might not get the results you expect. But yes, spring is a great time. I will be buying some plants for a garden that I am managing, so I will be getting them as soon as they put them on the shelves.
Yeah, and like it was commented, they might not, bloom as much this year, but it's their first year to kind of set roots, and
Right.
then you'll see them come back stronger that second year.
Yes.
And yeah, and it's just fun to watch them grow.
It's super exciting to be weeding an area and you think, why am I even weeding this? And then you find this teeny tiny lupin plant and you're like, oh my gosh, let me clean this up around you. It's very exciting.
Last year I had prairie smoke come up and I was like, okay,
Yay!
I've got to clean all around you.
That's so great.
Yeah, so those moments are definitely worth it. So our first question, not quite related to planting, but in terms of identifying. So say, you want to identify plants in your yard and you didn't keep the seed packet or the label. What's your favorite plant app for figuring out what you grew?
So I'm weird and old school, and I often don't use like Seek or like, you hold your phone up and you see what it is. That it does work decently. I like minnesotawildflowers.info. If you haven't visited that website, these volunteers have put together this unbelievable website that has tons of native plants, some of the plants we don't want, some of the invasive plants, weeds. I mean, it's super crazy. And there is a search that you can use, like an advanced search. So you can put in like, what does the leaf look like? What does the flower look like? It's super great. I really love it. I still look up things on that one because they've got good tidbits. They have identification characteristics. They talk about plants that look like that plant and how to tell them apart. So I usually go for that. I know there are some helpful books. I would try to get one that's just for Minnesota or like the Midwest, because there's a lot of plants out there. And if you're looking for one specific one and you like keep reading and wasting all of your time reading about, oh, that one's in California. Oh, that one's in Washington State. I don't need to look at those ones. That can be super helpful. If you see a plant and it's not blooming and you don't know what it is, if it's not bothering you, you can wait for it to bloom. And that usually helps you figure out what it is. Flowers are very identifiable for the most part. Sometimes it can be hard to know how to describe a leaf in a search. So that can be helpful.
And so if you are using an app, there's a lot out there, but I like iNaturalist as one that I use. And you can take several photos of your flowers. So, the whole flower, maybe a close-up, if it is blooming, a close-up of the blooms, a close-up of the leaves. And then you can either submit it for other individuals to help you identify it. So you're submitting an observation. It's a citizen science platform. But they also have really good artificial intelligence, and it will often point you in the right direction. So I sometimes need that quicker answer. So that's what I use when I'm trying to figure out something in my garden.
Yeah, and I have Seek on my phone, and that actually at least helps bring it sometimes just narrower. Like if you're looking at a flower and it says it's in the mint family, that actually does narrow it down a lot. So you can almost go from there. I've also had it misidentify. So if it gives you a species, sometimes it helps to look it up to make sure that it's correct. Because that, like you said, artificial intelligence and stuff they use is still building its data. So sometimes it's not sure what it's looking at. So
yes, I would say any app you use, don't trust it at face value, then go back to a different resource and make sure that it matches up.
Right.
Okay, quick question. This is from Claire. Will you please repeat the type of fly that pollinates Jack in the Pulpit?
Oh,
Jack in the Pulpit, such a cool flower.
I know, it's a fungus gnat. So if you've ever had indoor plants and you've had a fungus gnat infestation, they're the worst. But apparently that flower gives off a scent that attracts the fungus gnats. There's a couple other cool plants that smell terrible that attract certain species of flies. I think skunk cabbage is a big one. that actually does attract flies and it smells terrible. I've never actually smelled a Jack in the Pulpit flower. I have been in the woods with them and I don't remember smelling anything gross. But yes, apparently the fungus gnats pollinate that guy.
No, that will be on my list this year. I have Jack in the Pulpit that comes up in my backyard, but I have never, they're, even if they're tall, they're maybe only like a foot tall. I've never gone down and sniffed it.
Right? Yeah, they're kind of low to the ground. Usually at the time that I see them, there's some mosquitoes and I'm interested in moving on, but they're very cool plants. I love them. They're great.
So we have a plant care question. Laura has ordered bare root flowers. So any special considerations, when putting those in the ground versus, your regular 6-packs or 4-inch pots that are already in soil?
I've worked more with the pots that have the soil, but I want to say bare root, you want to probably focus on making sure there aren't a ton of air pockets when you plant them, because there isn't soil already around those ones. So when you put them in the ground, you might have to just make sure you squish enough soil in there to make sure there aren't a ton of air pockets, because those air pockets could affect the plant, or water could get in and the plant could tip over, or something like that. But oftentimes, if sites sell bare root plants, they have a lot of tips for how to plant those bare root plants. I know when you first get them, if you don't plant them right away, you got to make sure that those roots stay moist. Otherwise, you could damage your plants. So.
And Sheila has a plant list question. So she is, up in the area of the refuge, kind of in the Santiago Duelm Foley area. She was curious if there was, and this is something we can put our heads together, a list of plants for that specific area. I would think that's maybe more clay soil. If I've got my directions right for where Foley is in relation to the refuge.
Yeah, it might be. I know some sites do pick plants for clay soil, like seed mix lists. I'd have to look and see the DNR plant list thing, the plant list that's on the DNR page. And I think I had the link to like the main pollinator garden page. There's a drop down further on it that says something about like plant lists. That actually breaks it down into habitat, like mesic southern prairie and northern wet prairie, and there's a lot of stuff on there. There might actually be one that helps for that area, because I think they have a map of where all of that is, but I know a lot of people get sad when they have clay soil because it's kind of a tough soil to use. But if you're not sure, there are a lot of native plant companies that certainly could help you out if you wanted to give them a call. They might know what plants do better. Definitely avoid plants that say sand, because those are not really going to do very well. But some plants tolerate a wide range of conditions. I think purple prairie clover doesn't mind being in sandy, and it doesn't really mind being in clay. But I can look into that and see if I can find something that would be helpful.
And I found one resource that I'll post. I know Heather Holm has a lot of great resources, so I'll post the link to her pollinator resources overall, which includes, that stem nesting diagram that we already shared in our presentation. But she has a specific handout for sun and clay soil. So it not shady clay, but if you have a sunny spot with that. And she is local, so it's definitely at least Minnesotan based. And another way, if you really want to make sure that it historically occurred in your county, something like Minnesota Wildflowers or something like that will tell you the range of the plants, or sometimes even on the native plant vendors as well. If you're looking on their online lists, their profiles of each plant will tell you, and it'll show counties in Minnesota. So you could create a list and then narrow it down if it didn't occur in your county. That would be another way. A little bit more work, but it's worth it in the long run.
Well, and another thing, if there's like a scientific natural area or like some sort of DNR management area really close by, you could visit there and see what kind of native plants grow there. Because often if they grow in that area that's near you, they'll probably grow where you are. So you can always visit an area that might be similar. And if you go to an area and you don't know if it's sand or not, you can look at the soil and see if the conditions are similar to what you have in your yard.
And, you know, as well, even if you just go walk into a native plant vendor, they're very well versed, and, you know, you could talk to them and they are, you know, super knowledgeable and happy to share their love for plants with you. So, you know, you could chat with them too. Okay, our next question, and we'll take, you know, one or two more. It looks like we only have one question right now, but we're getting there on time. This has been a good program, but is where to find, what's a good place to get design ideas? And I think there's just, there's so many options. It depends. There are a lot of good online resources. I think the longer PDF that I posted about planting for pollinators, that 41-page document, probably, I think that has some information about design. And there's even specific pollinator books for Minnesota that have that design. And, you know, if you don't want to invest in the book, you could look at checking it out from a library. But there's just so many different options, but it's an important thing to consider if you want that more manicured, intentional look.
Yeah, and you might, some companies, even the native plant companies, actually have some examples. Generally speaking, it's whatever their local conditions are, but they may have like an idea of a wild pollinator garden and maybe a more cultivated one. But I think there's a decent amount of resources on websites and like native plant sellers and stuff, because they, generally speaking, want you to go native. So they usually have a lot of different ideas, because it is, you know, it's like planting any garden. There's a lot of different things you can do with it. You know, I mean, shape, size, all of that stuff is certainly a factor. So,
and if it's all too overwhelming, because sometimes it is, there are individuals who have a passion for this and can, you know, for a fee, design the area with the look and feel and everything, you know, it's beneficial for pollinators, that plants that bloom in the spring, summer, fall. So you'll have color, pollinators will have food, everyone's happy.
Yeah.
Okay, one last question, because I think it's a really good one. And I have one idea, but maybe you'll have more, Jenny, to throw out there. Anne asks, are there some native botanical gardens where you could kind of see some of these plants and get ideas from? And the first one that comes to mind for me is, it's in the Twin Cities, in Theodore Wirth Park on the north side of Minneapolis, or St. Louis Park. The Eloise Butler Wildflower Garden has primarily native species, and a lot of shade species too. So that would be one that would have plant labels, you know, have that very, you know, you could walk through and say, okay, I like this plant. It's very active with bees, because sometimes it's fun to see which plants are popular. But any others that come to mind for you, Jenny?
Well, the one that popped in my head might be the Arboretum, and I can't remember where that is, somewhere in the Twin Cities, but they have
Chanhassen.
they have like non-native gardens and native gardens, and I think they have a little bit of everything there. And they probably, I don't know if they have plants labeled per se, but I'm pretty sure they have like the areas labeled that you can look at. So you can like go to the pollinator garden and look at that one. Although some of those gardens you have to be a little careful, because pollinator garden to some people doesn't always mean native garden.
Right.
So some of the plants you find in there might not be native. They kind of just go for the ones that look to attract the most things. And oftentimes those are natives and sometimes they aren't. It just kind of depends on how that specific gardener wanted the look to be. I'm trying to remember if the conservatory at the Como Zoo has a native garden. I don't think they do.
I'm trying to think. Laura mentioned Clemens in St. Cloud for some great gardens. I'm not
Clemens
familiar with that
Bonsinger.
one.
I know one of their sections is cultivars, but they may have put in a pollinator garden area. They have decent sized gardens along the river there that you can look at. I know some of the areas have been restored to native, but I'm not sure that they have labels. So you might have to bring a book or an app or something to look at those plants.
Yeah, and I think, you know, just in your time outside, if you're hiking at the refuge or other areas that focus on native plants and habitat, even just taking pictures of, you know, ones that you particularly like for their color or activity or smell, you know, anything like that, that's helped me develop kind of my favorite plant list that I want to incorporate in things. So if you're looking to buy plants this May, that's tough because they probably won't be blooming when you're looking to buy.
Sometimes they do. I worked in a native nursery and every so often we would get those plants, put them on the shelf and they're like, oh my gosh, it's blooming, it's great.
Well, but for generating your list, like if you're going out in the prairie, there's just a little bit of a delay. But it's always fun because if you're starting a native garden, you're likely to add to it going forward.
Yes, you will usually find other plants that you want to stick in there because you might be like, hey, I don't have pasque flower in here and I want it. And I do like that flower. That's a nice flower.
Yeah, I didn't have prairie clover and last year, or prairie onion. And so those were two on my list, but they're short. So they had to be like in the front of the garden. I didn't want them hidden.
Right? Yeah. And I mean, like for me, I prefer maybe a more wild garden, but even that, if you buy some new short plants, you might want to stick them in the front. I mean, they'll spread as the seeds go, but like, you know, because then you can see the labors of your work and be like, I planted you last year and you're great. So.
Okay. Wow. We don't have any other questions and we went a little bit over. So I think we will tie it up right now. Both Jenny and I are excited for you to venture off or add to native plantings that you already have. And yeah, we will call it a night with that. And we thank you for joining us tonight.